Inside of the concentration camps, with the Third Reich in the Nazi Empire, there were incredibly strict beliefs as to what was expected of women. Hitler and the Nazis wanted women to act as housewives, who would raise as many children as possible for the Empire, and they were even incentivised to do this through financial grants and medals. However, the wives of the commandants of the concentration camps often lived very strange lives compared to their murderous husbands. Some wives of commandants even claimed their husbands were ordinary family men who would come home from work and would act as great fathers, despite the fact their day job saw them slaughtering, torturing and brutalising prisoners inside of sites such as Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. But others claimed they had no idea what their husbands were doing, and some even testified for them at war crimes trials, but their words could not save them from the hangman's gallows and their executions. This is a story of the ignorant wives of the commandants of the concentration camps, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most barbaric war criminals in history was Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who claimed he wanted to do things different inside of the camp which he built to become the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War. He was in charge of many evil guards, but Höss in 1929 married a woman named Hedwig Hensel. She was 21 when they married, and they met as part of their commitment to the Ottoman League, a political group that promoted a back-to-the-land lifestyle in Germany. Both Rudolf and Hedwig were outspoken and they fell in love, and at this time she would never have believed that she would marry one of the most barbaric war criminals. The couple had 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and their youngest daughter was actually born inside the confines of Auschwitz in the site, and she was born at the very place where her father committed some terrible crimes. Following their marriage, Höss joined the Nazi Party, and he rose throughout the SS, to the point where he was asked to investigate the possibility of making a concentration camp in Poland, and this site became Auschwitz, and Höss became the commandant due to his close friendship with Heinrich Himmler and his report he wrote. However, Hedwig and their children would go with Rudolf Höss to live inside of the Auschwitz camp, and specifically inside of a villa nearby, where they had slaves in the form of prisoners of Auschwitz who would work in the house and would also perform work on their gardens. The family could not see the chimneys of the crematoria buildings, but a large wall obscured the view of the camp, and their villa was very lavish compared to the suffering what was occurring inside of the camp. Hedwig never needed anything, as she always received the best food and furnishings for her home, and it was living in luxury, and was a normal family home also. They had photographs on the walls, like any family home would, but Hedwig Höss claimed she had little knowledge, if any, of what her husband was getting up to at work. He was a mass murderer, but she claimed she knew he was just a member of the SS, and she did not know what he was responsible for, and she claimed she did not understand that he was responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. Her son Klaus used to even beat and whip the servants and prisoners inside of the home who were working, and Hedwig was ignorant to her husband's work. Rudolf Höss lived a double life, where he would go and run Auschwitz during the day, but spend time being a father in the evening. However, the knowledge she had about her husband's work has been questioned, as it was said by a former gardener that Frau Höss reminded me about an incident, forcing me in doing whatever she asked to do. The couple hated everything that was Polish. Frau Höss often used to say to me that all Jews had to disappear from the globe, and there would even come a time for English Jews. But Hedwig Höss at the end of the war played the ignorance card to avoid any form of punishment, but as she had prisoners as servants inside her home, she must have known some things about Auschwitz and the life of the camp. However, during one explosive moment, Hedwig overheard a conversation between Fritz Brecht, the Gauleiter of Silesia, saying what was happening inside of Auschwitz involving the gas chambers and the crematoria. Hedwig Höss dealt with this with shock, and she was distressed that her husband was responsible for mass slaughter. She flew into a rage and even ran off to Flensburg with her eldest son, and she would be arrested by the Allies and was interrogated for weeks about the location of her husband, who was hiding out as a gardener under a false name. Eventually she gave over information around this, and her words led to her husband's arrest. She left Germany and moved to America and did remarry following her husband's execution, But many questioned what she knew about Auschwitz and the work her husband was doing, and many said it was unbelievable that she knew nothing. One of the most ruthless commandants of the concentration camps was Josef Kramer, who became known as the Beast of Belsen for his brutality. He was a long-standing member of the Nazi Party, and he served as a commandant of a number of camps, and had been the commandant of Natzweiler Struthof before he was sent to Auschwitz to oversee specifically Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the main extermination centre inside the deadliest concentration camp. He was brought to the site to manage the gassings of new transports, but many witnesses saw him driving prisoners into the gas chambers himself. But at the end of the conflict in 1944, Kramer was sent to Bergen-Belsen to oversee the large influx of inmates who were sent there. Kramer's rule was incredibly harsh, and hundreds were dying of disease, starvation and overcrowding. It was where Anne Frank was killed, and Kramer remained at the camp during the final days of the site, and even when the British liberated Belsen, and they found over 10,000 corpses scattered all around the camp. Josef Kramer was found to have been one of the most shocking beasts of the Second World War, but his wife would turn up to her husband's war crimes trial, the Belsen trials, to try and save him from the hangman's gallows. Rosina Kramer was the wife of Josef, and she would have lived with her husband inside the number of camps where he worked, and she arrived at the trials to give evidence, and she would be Josef Kramer's only witness. A news article outlined what happened when she got to the trial, and it was shocking, and it said, "As Mrs. Kramer, wife of the Beast of Belsen, left the court, where she gave evidence yesterday, a woman slapped her face. The woman was one of a group of prosecution witnesses waiting in the courtyard. As the police hurried Mrs. Kramer away, another woman shouted, 'Your husband killed my husband and children in Auschwitz. You still have your children.' She was described as a small woman dressed in black velvet with a hat cocked at a jaunty angle. But her evidence was shocking, but it would not spare her husband or save him. Rosina Kramer stated, 'Whilst at Auschwitz my husband came in one day and said, "Those who are responsible for destroying so many persons in the gas chambers, I don't think they can be sleeping easily." At Belsen he came home and paced the floor crying, saying, why? He told me many times his duty was to take care of internees at Belsen, night and day. He worried because so many had to sleep on the bare floors and huts. But what shocked the courtroom was that Rosina Kramer, with this, actually admitted that she knew what was happening inside of the camps, and she knew what her husband was doing. Despite her trying to defend her husband, it was in vain, and Josef Kramer was executed by the British executioner Albert Pierpoint inside of Hamlin prison. One of the most depraved commandants of the Second World War was Amon Göth, who is depicted in the film Schindler's List as a murderous brute of a man who would sit on the balcony of his villa, patrolling over the Krakow-Plaszow site with his rifle, taking shots at the prisoners. He was a man who ran the horrific site, and thousands of people were executed and killed inside of the camp. One inmate said of Göth that, "As a survivor, I can tell you that we are all traumatised people. Never would I, never believe that any human being would be capable of such horror, of such atrocities. When we saw him from a distance, everybody was hiding, in latrines, wherever they could hide. I can't tell you how people feared him. He ordered the executions of many. If one prisoner did not pull their weight, then Göth would order the group punishments and sometimes horrific executions. He was a man who would mistreat anyone, including even two of his maids, and he was married twice throughout his life. Amon Göth, as mentioned, was married twice. His first wife was a woman who his parents chose, and he did not love her. And his second wife, Annie Geiger, would move with him into Krakow-Plaszow and lived inside of the villa. It must have been obvious what her husband was doing, as how could she ignore the fact her husband would be sat on the balcony of their home shooting at people. But also Göth would have a number of mistresses, and one of them, a woman named Majola, also visited the balcony and the villa and was photographed doing so. It's not known the extent that Annie Geiger knew about her husband's actions in the concentration camp her husband was overseeing. She did divorce Amon Göth in 1944, but he would also fall from grace, as he was deemed too brutal and depraved for even the SS, and was even executed for his crimes. One of the most notorious wives of a concentration camp commandant was Ilse Koch, who was married to Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald. Ilse was a woman who was an ardent Nazi, and she believed Hitler's ideology that he would fix the problems within Germany following the end of the First World War. She met her husband at local SS meetings in Dresden, and she then went with her husband during his work appointments and particularly accompanied him inside of Buchenwald, and she became a horrific brute in her own manner. Buchenwald as a camp was huge, and inside the conditions were very harsh, and the inmates were kept in a constant state of starvation and were forced to conduct very hard labour. Disease was common, and there were executions every single day, with shooting sites executing prisoners of war, and there were also brutal guards who worked there. But Ilse Koch lived the life of luxury inside the commandant's house and villa, and she made her home her own. Ilse Koch was enthusiastic about her husband's work, and she even became one of the most feared Nazi guards herself, despite the fact she was simply just the commandant's wife. The pair drew up plans to create a huge sports arena, and Ilse would ride her horses, and this cost a huge sum of money, and had been embezzled from the Nazi party and stolen from the prisoners of Buchenwald. Ilse Koch rode her horses inside and out of the arena, and she became very feared, and she would taunt the prisoners, who would look at her, and she also whipped them. She sometimes ordered inmates to be executed and sent to the gas chambers, and she also allegedly may have collected depraved furniture made from the skin of inmates. Ilse also tried to entice a number of prisoners who worked as servants inside of the camp, and she tried to lure them wearing provocative clothing, and would also organise beatings of prisoners and would whip them and beat them with her bare hands. She even, it's believed, killed inmates with them. She gained a huge amount from the slave labour used to build some of her facilities, but at the end of the war she would be tried. Her husband was arrested, as was Ilse, by the Nazis in 1943, as they were found guilty of embezzling the Nazi state. But Ilse Koch was later held inside of a Gestapo prison, before the Americans then arrested her. She was brought to trial twice after the war, and she was released early the first time, and it was said by a general that, "I hold no sympathy for Ilse Koch. She was a woman of depraved character and ill repute. She has done many things reprehensible and punishable, undoubtedly under German law. We are not trying her for those things. We were trying her as a war criminal on specific charges." But a second trial saw her convicted of 7 counts of incitement to grievous bodily harm, 1 count of incitement to attempted murder, and 1 more count of incitement to murder. With this she was sentenced to life imprisonment, and even forfeited her German civil rights. But inside of Eichach prison, on the 1st of September 1967, guards burst into Ilse's prison cell to find her hanging. She in her final months had delusions in which she believed the prisoners of the concentration camps were abusing her and plotting to kill her, and she would leave a note for her son that said, "There is no other way, death for me is a release." She died by her own hand inside of her prison cell. Another commandant of Auschwitz was Arthur Lieber-Henschel, a man who was brought into the deadliest concentration camp following the sacking of Rudolf Höss. Lieber-Henschel was not as ruthless as Höss, and he would make many changes, including halting the selections of the gas chambers, and he also removed the torturous standing cells. Höss later came back, and Lieber-Henschel was moved to the already empty Majdanek site, as he was seen as a man who was not brutal enough. Regardless of this, he would be executed for his crimes. However, his marriages were also bizarre. He had 1 son and 3 daughters by his first wife Gertrude. However, he also had a second son by his second wife, Anneliese. His first wife suffered a mental health breakdown after the war, possibly linked to the brutal work her husband was doing and overseeing. She later took her own life inside of a hospital for the mentally ill in 1966. There were many other wives of Nazi commandants who would later be arrested. They were often subjected to denazification processes, in which authorities would categorise them depending on how serious their devotion was to the Nazi cause and authorities. There is less written about the wives of the commandants of the concentration camps, as opposed to the high-ranking Nazi wives, but it's interesting to consider the differences these had. Depending on the work of their husbands and what they were doing, the different class of war criminals categorised these women. Some of the women who married commandants and senior SS guards were themselves virulent Nazis and had bonded with their husbands over their ideological beliefs, and some had even met their husbands at Nazi rallies. But when they entered the concentration camp systems, they often benefited from the lifestyles that their husbands' barbaric work brought. They lived inside of fancy villas when prisoners were sleeping on floors next door in tiny barracks which were overcrowded, and their homes were heated and warm in winter when people were suffering in the camp. But many of these women, as mentioned, also had slaves and help inside of the home with prisoners working for them. These were often treated very poorly, but the women must have known where the prisoners came from and where they went at the end of the day after their work. Many were incredibly ignorant and claimed at the end of the war that they did not know anything, and they said they did not understand about the deadly nature of the concentration camps. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.